Welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me, Episode 4, Preparing for the Bombers. Eric, had any preparations been made for possible bombing campaigns in a future war?
In 1924, in fact, there had been a committee set up in the Home Office that discussed this actual problem. Even though there is no actual war envisaged with Germany or anyone else, but as bombers were developed in all countries, it was decided that they'd have to consider what to do. It was thought that cities would be bombed, and therefore something had to be done with the populations. Two policies were adopted. One was evacuation, and the other was the building of shelters. We had a big one, to my mind anyway, because I was 5 at the time, that was built in the bottom of our garden called the Anderson Shelter. When it came to the time for evacuation, my mother told Kitty and I that because when the bombers came, it would be so dangerous to live in London, we will be evacuated, Kitty and I. And so we then wanted to know, well, what was going to happen to Mum and Eddie, our baby brother, born just a short time before, in July 1939. And my mother assured us that because we got this shelter, they could dive in and be safe, which immediately raised the question in Kitty's and my mind, well, if they could stay in London, and when the bombers came, they could dive into the shelter and be safe, why couldn't we stay in London, dive in the shelter when the bombers came and be safe with them? Why did we have to go away? Well, my mother said, well, we'll show you what the shelter's like. And so she took us down. Unfortunately, since it had been built, there'd been water seepage into it, and the water was about 4 feet deep in it. So that rather undermined her argument about it being able to be dived into, unless you meant literally into the water. She said that would be sorted. In any case, Kitty and I would have to be evacuated. So we went back into the house, tried our arguments again, and then again Mum said we had to be evacuated, but she would not come with us because she needed to stay in London to look after Dad, who had a job with NAFI and so wouldn't be called up.
What was NAFI?
NAFI had been set up in World War I, and it was a sort of recreational thing. Navy, Army and Air Force Institute. And they were set up on all the service stations. And because deliveries need to be made from a central London depot, lorry drivers were required. And my father, being a lorry driver for NAFI for years, was kept on, which meant, in a way, he was already called up. And so he didn't have to go to any of the services himself, but could remain in London doing these deliveries all round the home counties.
So he drove for NAFI, and what else did he do in the war years?
Before the war actually began, the government had set up the system of ARP wardens, Air Raid Precautions. The councils were required to set these up as war approached, and the first job of the air raid wardens was to make people observe the blackout. The cry always was, put them lights out. But as things progressed and the bombing actually began, their tasks increased enormously. They were not only required to observe the blackout, they were to give information of what people should do in the way of shelters. They handled the stirrup pumps for when there were fires to use locally. They stored those and taught people how to use them. And then, almost immediately the bombs began to drop, they were always on for first rescue. So a bomb hit, exploded, there were casualties, and the warden's job was to go in, put out the fires, if they were small enough, with the stirrup pumps, pull people out of the wreckage, organise rescue attempts by neighbours and volunteers, and generally take control. And as the bombing went on, that was what my father did too.
What was the point of the blackout?
In the First World War, the Germans had sent Zeppelin airships across, and they bombed London and some of the South ports. Then later they were superseded by the Gotha bombers, which inflicted more casualties. And so when World War II began, precautions were necessary for that. The blackout was intended that when the bombers came, there would be no lights to guide them to where the big cities were. While that was very effective, of course, for London, the Thames was a very obvious and a very clear aiming point, because primarily the Luftwaffe wanted to bomb all the docks, which were very heavily used. Similarly in Liverpool and other port cities.
So your mother planned to send you and Kitty out of the city to be safe. What did you think of that?
Kitty and I worked out what was going on in Mum's mind, really. We were convinced that because she got this new baby, she just wanted to get rid of us, because we'd be in the way of her playing with the new baby all the time. I'm sure that was not in my mother's mind. But she had had another premonition, and that was that if Kitty and I stayed in London, we would be in terrible danger, and that it didn't apply to Eddie and herself. So, to be safe and avoid the events of this premonition, we had to be evacuated. And later events proved, in fact, that Mum was right again.
Audio copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series via ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.